So, hello everyone, thank you for the floor. My name is Martin, and I'm second year of my PhD studies at Community University Bratislava, and my contribution is the topic that I mentioned before, and this is common good as a corrective to liberal conception of human rights, which is the same as the topic of my dissertation thesis, and the article will be slightly different than the topic, but I think you all understand. My structure is divided into two parts, and part one is subdivided into three parts. I will be dealing with liberal conception of human rights, principle of the common good, and Republican conception of human rights. My aim is to present you the most fundamental principles or information, and I'm not aiming at any concrete solutions. This is because my dissertation research significantly exceeds the possible scope of this presentation, and also because I think the topic hasn't been extensively explored in our geographical context, and it's possible that most of you have never encountered it before. So try to view my presentation as an introduction to the constitutionalism of the common good in terms of the concept, content, and the reason why it has been promoted so far as an alternative to the current state of affairs by some famous scholars like Ferenc and etc. Do not worry, I will not waste time discussing the liberal conception of human rights, but I consider it necessary to point out some of its negative aspects that, in my opinion, require correction, which I address in my dissertation thesis. However, it is not entirely possible to avoid the theoretical foundations of liberalism and its conception, so I ask for your patience in this regard. Liberal conception of human rights, or liberalism, was built under the influence of a series of events that occurred in Europe, such as religious conflicts, rise of a modern sovereign state, and etc. It has therefore spread throughout the world. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because I think that liberalism was the best possible answer to the demands of the time, such as demands for the freedom in all its terms, like personal freedom, freedom of speech, religious freedom, etc. And the question is whether liberal conception of human rights is still truly liberal. There are several points to be discussed, for example, conflicts between individualism and pluralism, neutrality and democratic deficit, which I will be addressing in my thesis. In its pure sense, liberalism means strict equality. Freedom is equal here, and all rights are subject to the condition that the exercise of any particular freedom is to be respected only insofar as it doesn't violate the same equal freedom of others. Equal freedom could, of course, mean everyone unrestricted freedom to do as he or she pleases, including the right to kill or injure somebody. That's why the liberalism also has limitations, which are totally right. The basic content of those limits is, for example, the exclusion of force and fraud, so the interactions among human beings can take place with the free consent of each party. Coercion is justified only against someone who violates those limits. That's liberalism in the pure sense. But there are conflicts between individualism and pluralism, which I would like to address. In my opinion, just as globalization and, for example, neoliberalism, which we are experiencing today, intensifies, individualism in human rights intensifies under the guise of pluralism. Like any other concept, liberalism is not just offered, it is often imposed. On the one hand, it is logical, as no concept can be spread with complete freedom, but true pluralism is only then an illusion here, in my opinion. Individualism is a core value of liberalism, which is promoted primarily through autonomy, and it overrides not only the community aspect, but also the autonomy of others as well in some cases, and I will demonstrate further. On the one hand, we have ordinary values, and on the other hand, we have higher order values. To ordinary values, there are basic values like love, for example, not basic actually, but in terms of some theoretical foundations, it's basic. And the higher order values are, for example, not for example, but exactly, equality, freedom, and autonomy. The former, the ordinary goods, must be interpreted in the light of the higher order values and must be consistent with them. To put it another way, using a slightly absurd example, love is an individual emotion that belongs to ordinary goods. Sexuality is also expression of that love, of romantic love, and therefore it also belongs to ordinary goods. if someone feels romantic love for another person and that another person doesn't reciprocate that feeling, that first person is not entitled to sexual approach or sexual expression of that feeling because it is overridden by the autonomy of that another person, which is totally logical and right. But sometimes the values of the same higher order conflict with each other in two contradictory ways. And I will try to demonstrate it on the case law of ECTHR. Concerning two articles, Article 8 and Article 9 of the Convention. Article 8 covers the private and family life, and Article 9, the religious freedom. To be more specific, autonomy is addressed in both of these areas, even it is not even it cannot be on the first sight. Autonomy is defined as the ability to see oneself as the author of a moral law by which one is bound. Is a definition according to the Penguin Dictionary, and I think is relevant here. On the one hand, we have cases regarding or relating to Article 8 of the Convention, and the ECTHR perceives autonomy broadly here, in accordance with the definition I mentioned ago, so it allows people to act according to their own moral judgment. In practical terms, these decisions have given rise to a so-called positive obligation to create a legal framework of protection for same-sex couples or same-sex unions. In contrast, ECTHR is restrictive in its interpretation of Article 9. For example, in the case Pichon and Sergio versus France, it didn't allow the applicants to defend themselves against the legal consequences that were imposed on them for exercising their conscientious objection to the self-contraceptives. Autonomy is addressed in both of these areas. This because autonomy includes sexual autonomy, reproductive autonomy, and etc. Autonomy is the basis for all of these actions. Philosophically, these cases are not much different. What distinguishes them is the politics and values European Court of Human Rights has been promoting in recent years. For this reason, Article 8 currently overrides other articles relating to autonomy, such as Article 9, Article 10, and etc. This would be understandable, given that religious belief is not the core value of today's liberalism. It is understandable precisely because that regime is not neutral, not value neutral. But the problem is that this is not primarily about religious freedom, but about expressions of belief that can be held not only by Catholics, but for example, agnostics and atheists as well, expressions that are clear manifestation of autonomy. There are other possible problems, but I think that in current state, liberal conception of human rights is inconsistent with values, with liberal values, because the freedom is not really equal here. We have also democratic deficit. I think that some dynamic developments in human rights are being pushed through from behind the closed doors without adequate discussion and participation of the member state. For example, this can be seen in that judgment, Fedotova case and others with Russia and the others who followed him by using the argument of so-called emerging trend or clear ongoing trend. If you are interested in that argument, you can find articles on the web, but we don't have time for that presentation. These were the three main reasons why I think the liberal concept of human rights needs to be corrected, but the problem is that there are not too many options for correction if we want to avoid authoritarian regimes, which I would like to, which I want to avoid at all costs. That's why I'm interested in common good constitutionalism. But what is the common good and how does it connect to constitutional law? First of all, it is one of the theories of constitutional law. It can be divided into two parts, philosophical and practical. Today I will be, because of the time, dealing only with theoretical part. Common good constitutionalism adopts Aristotelian Thomistic view that man by his nature is meant to live in a community and can only flourish in that community. There are three main authors for the philosophy. First one, Aristotle. He, I will say it simple, connected common good to family duties in civic society. Then there was St. Augustine, who connected it with religion and religious duties, and Thomas Aquinas, who tried to connect law and religion at the same time. In Aquinas' view, The concept of law is communal. Law serves exclusively the interest of the community, never individual interest. Good is then individual, good is divided into individual and communal, and the ultimate communal good is happiness, which is then individualized. In eyes of Aquinas, the main goal of happiness was the salvation or union with God, which is not fully applicable today, of course, because we live in a secular state, luckily. However, as we know, his philosophy is based on certain synergy between faith and reason, but the constitutionalism of the common good is secular in spirit wherever possible, in today's terms. The main characteristic is that the content of laws and state policies shouldn't remain neutral on fundamental questions of human goods. Unlike some liberal theories, it doesn't even pretend to be neutral. But there are also possible problems which I try to address in my dissertation, and these are mentioned on the slide. The first one is that concepts of good differ. For example, we have different approaches, what is common and what is common good. For example, for utilitarists, it's about maximizing overall pleasure. For perfectionists, it is something different. Then there are many other more questions. The first one is how to define common good. The common good is not something tangible. It is a system of functioning institutions that promote fundamental values. In principle, countries may differ from one to another due to geographical and cultural differences. That's why there is no universal definition of what is the common good. But given an example, for example, if society agrees that, for example, family belongs to a common good, state should orient its policies to support the family at greatest extent possible, even at the expense of strictly individual goods. But the content of the common good cannot be separated from its creator. That's why I think it's more important to address the question, who should create the common good? There are three possible approaches. The first one is that the creator of the common good could be purely the state. The state is very strong in that concept, and I think it's dangerous because strong state is not always the very best option. Second, it could be purely NGOs or civic associations, but the state is really weak here, and that's also not really good because the state couldn't be able to enforce its legislation. And the third possible approach is that the common good will be created by a combination of the above, by certain participation or something like that. I think that participation is the best option here, but it is sometimes hard. However, when it comes to human rights, it is more complicated. Rights are not money that could be traded, and it's not even ethical to do so. If we allow state to interfere too much in redefining their content in accordance with the chosen common good, it will be human rights who could suffer primarily because the standard of protection may be lowered. But however, this relationship also works in reverse. For example, excessive respect for human rights can undermine the state and the system of human rights protection, as the rights of one person cannot be effectively protected by interference from others. And then we have questions relating to pluralism, for example. On the one hand, pluralism is possible within the constitutionalism of common good. For example, if we decide that something belongs to common good, there are many possible ways how to achieve that fundamental goal. For example, if we decide that family belongs to common good, state should, for example, create some new human rights or interpret human rights in a correct way, let's say that, or should give families some financial benefits. So there are many possible ways how to achieve some certain goal. But on the other hand, within the framework of the common good constitutionalism, there are correct answers to certain questions. These questions are mostly related to morality. These questions cannot be subject of discourse. For example, it can be said that deliberate killing of innocent person is immoral in all human rights regimes and concept. But that's the simple point. If we move that to cultural and ethical field, it is not as simple. For example, if a society agrees I will use that family example again, that a family belongs to a common good. It will depend on the creators of the common good, whether family mean for them only, for example, a union of men and women and children, or other alternatives are possible. If other alternatives are not possible here, the promotion of the common good would be at the expense of, for example, sexual minorities or other minorities as well. There are many other possible problems, but due to the time, I will not deal with them further. And the principle of the common good itself leads to a so-called Republican conception of human rights, which I will try to introduce briefly. This is because the common good concept is not a self-standing concept, but can only function within the framework of some conception of human rights protection. We have two dominant concepts of human rights regimes, or protection, or conception. The first one is liberal, and the second one is Republican. However, the Republican concept has also its risk, which I will try to focus on next. The fundamental differences between the Republican and liberal concepts are visible on the slide, and I will focus only on the essential parts, I think. The main difference is the idea of freedom. In the liberal concept, a person is free when their freedom is not interfered with in fact. In the Republican concept, you are free if you are not dominated by anyone. That is, for example, even when theoretical interference with your freedom is impossible. Given an example is, for example, freedom of speech. And the liberal conception of human rights, you are free as long as no one actually censors you. But under Republican conception of human rights, you are free if there is no possibility that, for example, media could even at theoretical level silence you. So under Republican conception, there doesn't have to be actual interference to say that you are not free. State is active here, and under liberal conception of human rights is passive. And in a Republican conception of human rights, state focuses on relationships between constitutional bodies, common good, and etc. Final remarks. I think the main goal of common good constitutionalism is to create a mechanism of state functioning that will be fully democratic, community-oriented, deliberative, and human rights protecting. I think some authors say that democracy is not an essential part of the common good because even an undemocratic state can contribute to a common good. And I think it's dangerous because I consider democracy to be necessary for participation, and without participation, it's, I think, authoritarian regime, and it's not good. So my goal in my dissertation is not to create a Republican conception of human rights, because there are several negatives that can be visible on that conception. For example, extensive paternalism, narrowing down the possibilities of a free life. Then there is a problematic relationships with NGOs, when on the one hand NGO help the state, and on the other they can be harmful for the state, like they undermine the state powers. And the problematic in our geographical context, I think, is also Republican culture, because I think that, for example, in Slovakia, we do not have Republican culture, and that's my opinion, and I'm open to another ideas. So, I would like to conclude by saying that as I mentioned ago, that there is no universal answer for what is the common good. But here is a specific definition from a judicial practice in the case of compulsory vaccination from 1905. I think pandemics shows us that excessive freedom and liberty for citizens isn't always appropriate, and if the state doesn't have the mechanisms to ensure that citizens obey its orders voluntarily, it must pull the emergency brake in certain situations. And I think the good implementation of common good principle can help the state to avoid the need to pull that brake. Thank you for your attention.